Is UConn really going to head into the NCAA tournament as a 5 or a 6 seed? Let's be serious. You're locked on.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, I just want to take a moment to say how thankful we are for all of you. We appreciate all of your support, audio, YouTube, the whole deal. Very excited about where this podcast is headed. We're proud to say we're the only daily podcast covering UConn men's and women's basketball, the hoops capital of the world. We're thrilled to bring you that coverage because you deserve it. To show that gratitude, we're giving back with donating 10% of our revenue to the Husky Ticket Project, helping send kids to UConn games. If you're enjoying the show, take a moment to subscribe, follow, and leave a review wherever you listen. Thanks again for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay. We've had him on the show before. He is somewhat a rock star in the analytics world. Evan Miyakawa joins us today, founder of evanmia.com, a college basketball advanced analytics website used by many coaches, journalists, media members, and fans for analyzing player, team, and lineup performance. Our dear friend and Dan Hurley's favorite, Evan Miyakawa. All right, we bring to the program Evan Miyakawa from evanmia.com. Evan, we already introed you. Really appreciate you jumping on for a second time here. All right, so I think myself and some of my co-hosts, we were having a conversation yesterday about UConn seeding. And I didn't bring you on here to make us feel better, but maybe you can give us some kind of insight into where they're currently seeded, according to Joe Lunardi and Mike DeCourcy, the two most prominent bracketologists. They're currently at 5. Have you seen, and I've seen some scenarios where they're at 6. Is this real life for the Huskies right now? I know the Big East is a little down, but tell us why they're in that, and do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do think they're kind of right inside the 5 line if you're kind of looking at consensus bracket rankings right now across a lot of those reputable sites like you mentioned. And I think the other part of this too is that's kind of the level that they're playing at right now. I have UConn right now as the 22nd best team in the country, and that's predicting how good they're going to be going forward, not just how good they've been so far. That's pretty much right in line with kind of how they've performed on the season. I think the thing is, if you look at their wins and losses, their win quality is pretty good. I have kind of an internal metric that I'll be debuting in a few weeks that kind of looks at the quality of your wins and the quality of your losses, and it's more expansive than just quad 1, quad 2, etc. And they're top 20 in that category, but their loss quality is only 55th in the country. And I think the main thing for that, the main reason for that is because you look at UConn's 4 losses, those 3 that you had in Maui and then on the road at Villanova. Those 3 Maui losses in particular have not aged very well. Memphis has been good, but the resume metrics don't love them. The predictive metrics don't love them. And then Colorado and Dayton have kind of fallen off a cliff since the beginning of their season. Colorado, I barely have inside the top 100 teams nationally, and Dayton is like 1-3 in conference play, and we thought they might be a top 25 team after their good performance in Maui. So that's not good. And then your best wins is, I guess, Gonzaga on a neutral, which is a great win, and then Baylor at home, but Baylor's not really been quite as good as people thought they would be this year. So a lot of the good opportunities that UConn had that they took advantage of haven't aged as well, and then the losses obviously haven't aged well either. You know, I think that's a little bit unlucky there, but that's sort of why they're kind of in that 5-6 range right now.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, like, because I know Ken Palm has the luck rating. And is there something in your metrics, or you can kind of give some color around that? Because, yeah, I mean, like I think I had Ryan Hammer on, who's a college analyst and college basketball analyst, and asked about those 4 losses are all by, with the exception of the Dayton, 3 of those 4 losses are by like 5 points. So there's kind of, and it seems like there's a lot of teams that are playing above probably their level when they see that UConn across the chest. Is there some kind of predictive metrics that handles that?
Yeah, so the luck metric that you're referencing on KenPom, basically what it's looking at is just like how close to winning were you in your losses and how close to losing were you in the wins. And So if you lose a bunch of really close games, you're considered unlucky because if you just flip a couple possessions here and there.
Sure.
But on my website, when I'm actually ranking teams, I'm just looking at the whole body of work, not just your wins and losses, but how you've performed on every possession. And so it's not going to majorly overreact to those close games when you win or lose just by a little. And so if UConn was still ranked like top 10 in the country on my website based on how they're predicted to be going forward, then I might be banging the drum a little bit harder saying like, hey, this team is better than what their wins and losses suggest. But based on the whole body of work across the whole game and how close those games have been, they still are, outside the top 20. So in that sense, I don't think I'd be too aggrieved right now if the bracket was out today that they were given a 5 or 6 seed. I think that's probably about where they deserve to be, based not just on their wins and losses, but just kind of how they've performed as a whole.
I know this is not your expertise, but I'm curious, just from like a human element perspective, do you think part of when they do get down to, if they're still in this metric line, because I'm going to ask you what the path to maybe a 3 or 4 is here, but I'm diverting for one quick question. Do you think the fact that it's UConn, that it's a back-to-back champion, that Dan Hurley is so outspoken, as would that make sense if they bumped up a line just based off of that cachet? You see it all the time with the other kind of high-level programs, Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, getting that 4 or 3 seed eventually, maybe undeservingly with the metrics.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think from a human element, you certainly could make a case that teams play their best ball against UConn. I think they probably fall in, 4 or 5 teams in the country that really are just every team's going to be juiced up and trying to play their best no matter what. I don't necessarily know if that's a line of reasoning that would go into then the committee giving them a seed line bump just for exactly that sort of reasoning. But I think bigger picture, just kind of looking historically at how the bracket is seeded, there is often a little bit of bias towards these blue blood teams. And so sometimes if the bracket comes out and you see a team like UConn on a seed line, more often than not, the reaction is going to be, wow, that's a seed higher or better than I thought they might have, as opposed to the other direction. So I definitely wouldn't put it out of the question that, if just based on blind resumes, they deserved a 5 or a 4, that they end up on the 4 or 3 line, one spot better, just kind of because of the cachet. But again, there's not really a formula to this. That's just kind of, historically speaking, what we've seen in some situations like this.
Sure. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to kind of talk about the best case scenario and then the best and worst lineups that Evan has seen in the UConn universe coming up after this. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps you as excited about anything from overs, unders, spread, money line, whatever you want, whether you're betting your favorite team or just looking to add some excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has you covered. Visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, you're back on Locked On UConn with Evan Miyakawa from evanmiya.com. All right, Evan, last question on the seeding aspect. Is there a path to climbing to a 3 or a 4 seed? Kind of what needs to happen that you would expect? We have Liam McNeely not playing. I don't know if that factors into any of the metrics you have. I know it does on the committee's deal when they look at the body of work. So what's the best case scenario for UConn?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that I think the best case scenario is a 3 seed. I think that is within the range of outcomes. And I think if you look at how UConn has improved in previous seasons, kind of in this period of January up through March, they often are playing their best basketball by the time we get to the tournament. And man, if you have a UConn team that's playing their best and has maybe, won the conference or won the conference tournament, there is just a lot of narrative and momentum that goes behind this team. And so if that happens, I think a 3 seed is certainly in the cards. I predicted UConn as a 4 seed back in December. I think that's probably, if I'm picking what I think is most likely, I kind of border between 4 and 5. And mainly a lot of that just goes to the coaching staff. As I mentioned, that's not quite the level they've been playing to so far, but you got to believe in Dan Hurley and his staff that they're going to kind of improve as opposed to, get worse. And so if I were kind of putting it there, that's where I'd put it. Worst case scenario, if things go wrong, I think still 7 or 8 is probably fairly reasonable, but I think you're more likely looking up towards a 3 or 4 as opposed to going down.
Yeah, no, we did a show like we want to stay away from the historical number 5 because no team has ever won a national championship. We've won it at 7. We've won it at 2, 4. So these are areas that I think just historically we want to try to stay away from that 5-12 matchup. Yeah, the only thing that comes to mind in terms of like a team that typically gets like the benefit of the doubt is like a Tom Izzo, Michigan State. Sometimes they're more on that 10 seed line lately where they potentially get an 8. They get almost like people are like, that doesn't make sense. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about here, where maybe they're deserving of a 5 or a 6 when they get a 4 or a 3 just because it's UConn, they finish strong, whatever. All right, enough seeding talk. It would beat a dead horse there. Let's talk about your lineup metrics. What is the best lineup with Liam and without him in your metrics on evanmedia.com?
So something new that I'm doing this year with lineups is not just looking at how well a lineup has performed on the court so far. That's certainly useful, but a lot of times you have pretty small sample sizes with that. The new thing that I'm doing is predicting how good a lineup's going to be going forward based on also how well it's done on the court, yes, but also just the individual player skills and qualities that you have in that lineup, and considering things like position and role balance and things like that. So when you sort of take all of that into account, UConn's best predicted lineup going forward is that lineup of Diarra, Ball, McNeely, Karaban, and Johnson. And I think that's been their second most used lineup behind the lineup where you have Terrace Reed in for Samson Johnson. That lineup's been pretty good as well. But that lineup that I mentioned is their best predicted one. If you kind of look on the flip side, one of the worst performing lineups that has been used a good amount is that lineup where you have Mahaney coming in for Diarra at the 1. That lineup just has not been performing well and doesn't predict as well. Without McNeely, I mean, here's the thing. McNeely is one of UConn's best players, and it's very clear that they are a better team with him. And if you look at UConn's top 6 lineups based on how well they're predicted to be, he's in all of those. So it's a significant drop if we're talking about lineups with and without. But the best lineup that I have in terms of how it's predicted to do going forward without Liam McNeely is Diarra, Mahaney at the 2, or however you want to say it, with Ball, and then Karaban and Reed. So a little bit of a smaller lineup. That lineup has only played about 18 possessions so far this year, so that's not a ton of time, but it's been remarkable in those 18 possessions. And when you look at kind of the individual characteristics of that lineup, it's a really good 3-point shooting lineup. It's also one of the most experienced lineups that the team can roll out. So if they play that lineup more, especially in the absence of Liam McNeely, I think they will have a lot of success.
Yeah, no, we've been talking about using Aiden in that kind of 2-guard role, either to sub Solo, who's been playing well, but his defense lacks. Mahaney's actually been playing a little bit better defense. I think Dan is starting to show that with kind of his rotations. What about, we asked Dan in some media availability last week about Ahmad Noel, him getting a little bit more burn. What are you seeing from the metrics? I know it's a small sample, but is there anything that you see from Ahmad Noel when he plays and where the team goes up or down, or is it pretty neutral?
Yeah, just pulling that up really quickly here. I think, again, one of the things, especially when looking at lineup data, is specifically looking at lineups, it's a little bit hard to overreact when you have guys playing that small of a sample size. But here's the thing. Ahmad Noel ranks comfortably number 1 on the team in a metric I have called adjusted team efficiency margins. That's just basically looking at how good is the team playing when you're on the floor, adjusted for quality of opponent faced. And again, he's only played, maybe the 10th most minutes on the team or something.
Sure.
But his adjusted team efficiency margin is like off the charts number 1. So that already points to the fact that there's a lot of promise in using him more. And so I'd be really curious to see him get more run, and potentially that will sort of unlock something new for this team that they haven't had in the first half of the season.
Well, you heard it here. I definitely banged the drum for Ahmad Noel, got the bug in Dan Hurley's ear, and he played, I think, 7 or 8 minutes against Georgetown and was pretty good. So hopefully that unlocks a different element to this UConn team. All right, when we return, let's talk about around college basketball. What is the data telling you? Some surprise in the metrics and kind of the broader scope of the NCAA basketball world with Evan Miyakawa after this. This message is brought to you by PrizePicks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, PrizePicks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports. Whether it's the playoffs or regular season, PrizePicks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying all the football action. Now it's playoff time, and there's no better way in the action then with PrizePicks, here's how it works. It's just more or less. And if your pick hits, you can win up to 100,000 times your cash. Yes, that's right. 100 times your money. $1 gets you 1,000 just to make a few simple picks. For me, I'm all about the hot takes this season. This week on PrizePicks, I'm looking at Lamar Jackson for more than 250 passing yards and Travis Kelce for more than 70 receiving yards. It's fun to predict and easy. Plus, with PrizePicks Flex Play, you can still double your money even with one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app, use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait. Take the game to the next level with PrizePicks. PrizePicks, run your game. And we're back on Locked On UConn. Evan Miyakawa, my guest, and dear friend of the program. Really appreciate you coming on. All right, man. Listen, you've given us a lot to chew on. I think you've kind of talked me off the edge on seeding. You've kind of pointed out some lineups that we thought our eyes are telling us that are playing well, but they wanted the metrics to back that up. Is there anything surprising from UConn? Like before we get to more on the broader scale, what have you seen from UConn metrics wise that stand out this season, good or bad?
Yeah, so on the player level, there's one thing that I noted specifically here, and it's the performance of Jalen Stewart, which has been kind of, I expected him to be ranked higher than he actually is, according to my advanced metrics. So he's ranked 9th on the team in Bayesian performance rating, which basically kind of measures or predicts how valuable a player is going to be going forward. And a lot of that is because his individual stats aren't that efficient. His best grade on sort of the individual stat level is like a B+ in 2-point shooting and turnovers. So he's not really excellent at anything. But the other thing that's been a bit concerning for Jalen Stewart is that the team has been much worse when he's been on the floor. And it's been pretty stark. When you look at the on-off splits, adjusted for kind of opponent face, because that's important to adjust for, UConn is performing, they're basically giving up 22 more points per 100 possessions when Stewart's on the floor versus on the bench. Both, and it's pretty equal offensively and defensively. So there's a significant performance drop. Obviously, you still want him to be a valuable part of your team, but based on my predictive metrics, he ranks towards the bottom on the team, basically bottom in terms of main rotation players. And so you definitely want him to be kind of performing at a better level than he has so far.
Yeah, that surprises me a lot. And the reason why I say that is because in the Villanova loss, he scored 10 points like right out of the gates and played really good defense against the leading scorer in college basketball, and Eric Dixon. So I think without them, that loss to Villanova is like by 10 or 12 because he kind of like held water for them for the first probably 10 minutes of that game. So yeah, but I definitely see that because it's the ebb and flow of his tenure at UConn has been like, surprise, I'm going to give you 10 points in 2 minutes, or the stats aren't that good. So I totally understand that. All right. Let's see. Is there anything from from UConn's metrics that you see from from Terrace Reed? I want to hear about him because people are clamoring for him to start, and I am tired of answering that question of why he shouldn't or should. In your metrics, is he a better fit? You already said the best lineup has Johnson in it, so I'm just curious from that perspective.
Yeah, between those two, BPR has Samson Johnson slightly better than Terrace, but I think the interesting thing to note is that this year, Samson Johnson's offensive metrics have been much better than Terrace Reed's, and that's flipped defensively. So I think Reed ranks as the second most valuable defender on the team behind Liam McNeely right now. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of the main thing that you're looking at is the team has performed better offensively with Samson Johnson, and then defensively have been more solid with Terrace Reed. I don't necessarily know if that's what you would have expected coming into the season, but that's kind of what we've seen. And so I don't necessarily know if it's really conclusive that you should be playing one more than the other. They both are pretty similar, and they both provide a lot of value to the team, albeit in different ways. And so to me personally, I don't necessarily think there's a huge difference between who starts and who comes off the bench. If they're both important and you're both kind of, we've seen games where Terrace Reed has been incredible, and we've seen games where Samson Johnson has been really, really valuable. So I don't think there's necessarily one formula fits for every single game. And I think the way that they're sort of handling it with allowing different guys to kind of lean more into their minutes based on how they're doing kind of makes sense.
For sure. All right, last question for you. Around college basketball, and people are going to think I'm picking on Duke because I'm a Duke hater. I am kind of, but here's the deal. In the Big 12 and the Big 10, larger conferences that are having better years, right? The Big 12 is the bloodbath. Ohio State just killed Kansas, or Iowa State, pardon me. Feels like the Big 10 is a little better than the ACC. Duke is a wagon. I totally admit that. However, are their metrics inflated because they are playing a very weak ACC, which just told me that Pittsburgh was an NCAA tournament team, and then Pittsburgh just went to Florida State. I think they've lost 3 straight since that Duke game. So talk to me about what makes that team so special, but are they getting a boost because they are playing a pretty crappy ACC schedule right now?
My basic answer to this would be no. And the reason is because when you play in a weak conference, there's pros and cons to it. The pro is that you're likely to smash a lot of your opponents and you're probably not going to take many losses. But the con is that if you lose, it looks much worse than if you lose a game in the SEC or the Big 12 or even the Big East in a lot of situations. And so basically what Duke has done is they have taken care of the business that they're supposed to take care of. And they've done it very convincingly so. And based on the strength of their team and the strength of the opponents that they've played, they've met or exceeded expectations in pretty much all of their ACC games. So in that sense, they're performing about the level that you would expect from a top 2 team in the country, given their schedule. Now, if they end up losing one of these games in the ACC, really any game, because they're favored in every game, they're going to be favored on the road, even pretty comfortably. The other day, I looked at it on Monday, and their chance of going undefeated the rest of the season, which does include a neutral game against Illinois, which is a non-conference game. That's probably their biggest hurdle of the season. Their chance of going undefeated the rest of the season is under 30%. So basically, even though they're going to be favored in all of these games, they're expected to lose a game or 2 or even 3. Sure. And as soon as they lose one of these games they're supposed to win, that's going to cast a lot more skepticism on them than if they lost, on the road against Houston in the Big 12 or something like that. Sure. So right now they're taking advantage of it, but if it flips, it's going to flip a lot harder than what you would see in some other conferences. So I think it kind of evens out.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that if I think what would even make it even more cast some skepticism is if they go undefeated in the ACC and they get smacked around by Illinois on a neutral site. That would really kind of show that my kind of thoughts about potentially losing to a better team, that they're not getting the test that they did early in the season against Auburn. So, all right, I said last question, but I want to ask you one more. Does Auburn need John Broome to win a national championship? How big of a loss is that for them if he's fully healthy, and are they the favorite going forward?
So I do have injury adjustments at my website that basically look at how much your team ranking or even game predictions change based on players being out. And before Auburn's home game against Mississippi State this week, they were ranked as the number 2 team in the country when he's healthy, and they dropped to the number 9 team in the country when he's out. That doesn't feel like that big of a drop because you're staying in the top 10, but there's such a big tier gap between the top 2 to 3 teams and kind of the rest of that top 10. So for me, that adjusted their line against Mississippi State about 4.5 points, which is pretty significant. And then they went out and hammered them. So I do think, though, that it's going to be a lot more challenging for Auburn to win a national title if John Broome is out. Now, here's the thing. The expectation is that he's only going to be out a couple weeks. And so really what you're hoping for as an Auburn fan is that you can sort of hold ship. And I think if they can perform at the level they're capable of, even without him, I think they can still hang on to a 1 seed. And if he's fully healthy by tournament time, then, all engines are go at that point. But if he is struggling health-wise, I still think this team is good enough to win a national championship. But I don't think they're going to be talked about in the same vein that like UConn was talked about last year heading into the tournament, where it's like UConn is for sure the favorite, Purdue is right there with them, and then there's kind of a gap after that. Right now, that's the way that people will be talking about Auburn and Duke and Iowa State heading into the tournament. If you don't have him, or even if he's questionably healthy, I think there's going to be a lot more hesitation, and I think that would be justified.
Fair enough. He's Evan Miyakawa of FanDuel.com. Really appreciate you jumping on, man. For the rest of everybody, that's been another episode of Locked On UConn. For Evan, I'm Mark Zanetto, saying stay locked on, stay connected. Make sure those toughness meters are always rising. And as always, go Huskies.
Go Huskies.